Hey everybody, my name is Fahad. I wanted to do a video on how to make combat in 5e faster because I've been seeing a lot of people ask the question, and it's a pretty common question when it comes to Dungeons and Dragons. So let's jump in. So first of all, like, who am I? Why am I in a position to even talk about this? Well, I'm a software developer and I'm also a game designer. I've made a post-apocalyptic action horror game called Spiritfall, which you guys can check out at spiritfall.net. Currently, it's being redesigned and made sort of completely different, but that's a different talk. Um, I got my start like 6 years ago in tabletop RPG games, so I'm still fairly a newcomer. But I've been in a year and a half long 3.5e campaign, and I've actually been in two 4-year long 5e campaigns that meet every other Tuesday. So basically, for the past 4 years, I've been playing D&D every week. I've DM'd a 1 year long 5e campaign, and I've DM'd a bunch of one shots. I've seen play that goes from like first level all the way up to like 17th level. I think some of our characters are 17th level now. So like the whole spectrum, I've basically seen it all. I've DM'd a one shot where characters were 19th level and we did a super high CR encounter. So I've seen the whole span of how combat can be. And earlier on the combat is quick, but as you progress, the combat gets really long. I'm also a TRPG enthusiast because my work on Spiritfall has led me to discover other games. So my oral isn't just limited to Dungeons and Dragons. I play Call of Cthulhu. I know about the Powered by the Apocalypse games. I love Dungeon World and I love Apocalypse World and I love Blades in the Dark. I've played Stars Without Number, and Spiritfall itself is like a D100 sort of mystery game. And I've checked out Fate and other Fudge games, and yeah. Oh, also, I have 3,000 hours or more on Roll20, which is actually kind of scary. It makes me wonder at least, what I've been doing with my life. Anyways, so yeah, why combat? Why are we trying to make it faster? So let's get on the same page. Combat's really slow. There's no real way to cut it. Um, Combat could be a lot faster, right? People want combat to be faster. Like, it's a known problem. I see people asking this question all the time. I'm in the Absolute Tabletop Discord and I'm in the Matt Colville Discord, and sometimes I see people ask this question in the Matt Colville Discord. And I think to myself, yeah, the game is slow. There's this dissonance between the amount of time we spend in game, in combat, versus the amount of time our characters in fiction are. I've had fights that have taken like 4 hours of real life time, and in the fiction, our characters have only been fighting for like maybe a minute at most. So yeah, it feels like combat is a big time sink, right? Let's say you've planned out your campaign, or you've got a sandbox style campaign, and you know threats are going to be coming at certain time windows, right? And you're waiting like 5 days for this threat to happen, but you wanted this threat to happen this session, but it's not going to happen because you got into a random encounter or your party is fighting somebody, and that encounter is going to eat up most of the time of the session. So I think people want ways to speed combat up. So, why is combat slow? Like, what about the game makes it slow? Well, you could say it comes down to how you run the game or how you play, but really it's game design. Um, the way you play the game is founded somewhat in some portion on the rules of the game. And in D&D, we have a war game heritage. D&D comes from chainmail and it comes from war games. It's basically a unit tactics war game where you control one person, right? Combat's highly structured, right? We roll initiative to decide who goes when. Um, and at higher levels, characters become bags of HP, right? I've been in so many fights, CR5 and above, where the enemies just have like hundreds of HP, and you're just swinging at them for multiple rounds, and like it's boring because there's really not much tactically you can do besides swing your sword or use a spell that does high damage to take them down, and it just takes forever. Um, at higher levels, you become bags of HP, and you also become sustainable. The paladin's got like so many points of lay on hands. The cleric can cast healing spells. Um, Even some sorcerer paths can cast healing spells. Bards can do healing, or they can do inspiration. Fighters have second wind. Barbarians take half damage. So, yeah, like characters just are hard to take down, you know. And then resurrection and all those spells, really, they can make fights go on for a long, long time. And that's part of the game. When you get to higher levels, you become powerful people. In the older editions of D&D, when you got to certain levels, it was expected that you stopped your adventuring life and you sort of the scope of the game expanded to like the kingdoms level. You built your own fortresses and strongholds, and like the game changed to be about that. But if you look at the rules of the game, right, in 5e and 3.5 and stuff like that, those systems are gone. They're sort of hand waved, and the GM takes care of them, which, in my view, means that they're not really part of the core game, right? The core game essentially is about adventuring from 1 to 20. You're always adventuring, and that adventuring consists of fighting. Adventuring consists of getting into combat. If you look at the abilities and the spells in the game, each of them have like these intricate rules and deep case specific events. If you look at, Fireball, it has a radius, it has a range, it has a damage it deals. Everyone has to make a save. So it takes time, right? Because if you cast Fireball, the DM now has to roll saves for all the enemies in the radius of the Fireball. And you might not know the distance of the Fireball or the radius or anything offhand. So there's time that's taken to look it up. The character sheets really don't help with that, right? The slots that they have for spells and abilities are relatively small, and the abilities themselves are relatively large in terms of text. So, like, you get into situations where a character casts a spell, and the game master doesn't know like every spell at the top of his head. Like, that's ridiculous. So he asks the player, "What does the spell do?" And the player doesn't know, and the player's like, let me find out." So it takes a while. The other thing is, there's this implicit assumption that most encounters are a death match, like characters fight to the death. You have your enemies fight to the death, the player characters fight to the death, they won't surrender. So that drags out fights even further. So I've been in fights that have lasted hours upon hours at higher CRs. And that includes fights against multiple enemies that are relatively close to our CR, but that also includes enemies that are way higher than our CR, and there's fewer of them. It just takes forever no matter how you crack it. Based off some of the ability synergies, characters can do many, many things on their turn. One of my dungeon masters, I'm also in a game with him where he's a player character, and he plays a bard, and he can do all these crazy things. He has bardic inspiration, and he can use cutting words, and he can change dice rolls, and he can summon Bigby's hands, and it just turns take forever. When you have advanced characters with complex abilities, the turns take a while. When you have characters that can attack a bunch of times, the turns take a while. So it just all contributes. It's the game design. No matter how you cut it, it's the game design. So there's three ways to speed up combat. The first thing is you can apply some dungeon mastering techniques, but because of the game design, there is a ceiling that you'll hit. And once you hit the ceiling, you'll probably not be able to gain any more speed out of the game unless you change the game. And that means you're changing rules, you're house ruling, and you're bending the spirit of the game. Now, if you do that, you can hit another ceiling, right? You can basically get combat to be as fast as possible within this framework of Dungeons and Dragons. The final thing you can do is if you don't care about the setting, if you don't care about the tone, you don't care about D&D as a system, you can check out other games, because there are games that are way faster. I'm going to be focusing on the first two because this is a talk about how to speed up combat in 5e, not like which game has the fastest combat. So the system recommendation things is just a bonus. But the thing is, like, you can look at other systems and you can steal things from them and make your game faster that way. Let's dive into dungeon mastering techniques. Okay, so the first thing you can do is you can play online. I mentioned I have 3,000 hours on Roll20. I think I have 3,254 to be precise. Playing online is really great for speed because You don't have to worry about tracking your abilities, and you don't have to worry about doing math, and you don't have to worry about measuring distances. You can set up macros on Roll20 or on your favorite tabletop website, and you can click a button and it'll roll the damage and roll the attack roll, and you have it all done there. You'd be surprised how much time is just taken up at the table rolling your damage and rolling your attack. And I know a lot of people say roll your damage and you roll your attack together, but really that's so marginal, right? Um, because you still have to do the math in your head, right? Um, a way to even get a way to get even faster is like don't ask the player or the dungeon master if it hits. Like if you know the AC, or just spell the AC out, and if it hits, it hits, right? Um, Now the thing is with this, right, is if you're playing in person, right, and your group's thing is playing in person, um, playing online is probably not the way to go, right? Because you want to continue playing in person. Real quick before I move on to that, I just want to say the other advantage of playing online is you have the rules compendium and spell blocks and stat blocks and all those rules at your disposal. So, you don't have, you can avoid that situation where a player casts a spell and you're like, what does it do? Because they can just click on the spell macro or whatever, and it pops out in the chat log, and you can see exactly what it does. But yeah, like, so I was trying to say before, if you're playing in person, you don't want to like bust out laptops and play online. So there's a few tools you can use, on your table or at your table to speed things up. You can use dice rollers like online apps or like on websites. Now, if you're playing in person, part of the allure of playing in person is like picking up dice and rolling. So just be careful with this because it sort of diminishes the joy of playing. Um, the other thing you can do as the game master is if you don't care, or the dungeon master, if you don't care about rolling, like if your goal is speed and you personally don't care if you have to roll, you can average the dice results. If you look at the stat blocks, if you look at all those other things, it tells you the average, right? So you can pick the average in a pinch, or if you don't care about rolling digitally, you can roll digitally. If you want your players to remember their abilities and stuff, you can write them down on index cards, or you can download spellbook apps on your cell phones and use those. Now, I mean, if you're letting your players have your cell phones at the table, that means you need to trust them to not to dick around and get distracted. And even if they do, it's really not a huge deal. The next thing we can talk about is CR balancing. So, generally speaking, if your dungeon master cares about the balance of a fight, he will pit you up against enemies that are slightly above your CR. And the reason why it's slightly above your CR is because when you fight enemies at your CR, it's still pretty heavily skewed towards the players. At higher levels of CR, or at higher CRs, um, you find out that you really need to beef the CRs up to threaten the party, right? So like we're level 15 in my friend Kyle's game, who also plays Willow, and we can routinely take on like CR 17 enemies. We can In my other friend Brady's game, we were level 17 and we can take on CR 22 enemies. Just because of how the encounters are balanced. So there's two different axes you can play with here. You can play with the amount of enemies you have, and you can play with their CR, right? Or you could vary the CRs up. I just chose to have a uniform amount of CR, or just like average the CRs together if there's different enemies, just to make things simpler. So if you want to be fast, the two options are you can have a few amount of enemies who are low CR, um, and that will have a fast fight, which favors the PCs, right? So if you want them to fight goblins or just mob enemies, just throw in a few of them and they'll quickly take them out. Now the opposite scale of that is if you have many high CR enemies, you're going to have a really fast fight that's favoring the enemies. If you have like 5 players and they walk into a dungeon and six mind flayers and an Umber Hulk jump out of the ground, yeah, your player characters are probably going to be toast in like a round or two. Um, Now, those are extremes. Your players might get bored if they're steamrolling, and they might get really frustrated if you're just throwing these super hard encounters at them. So you might go with a few mid-range CR enemies. That's going to be a slow fight. That's going to favor the PCs. These other options here are also slow fights, right? So if you have many low CR enemies, it's slower. than if you have a few low CR enemies. If you have few high CR enemies, it's going to be slow. If you want to challenge the player characters with a slow fight, go with many mid CR enemies, because the action economy is really important, man. And legendary actions really they really don't cut it in terms of action economy. Like, they help certainly, but still, in my mind, nothing really beats having a bunch of enemies. But that's an aside. So yeah, CR balancing is something you can do. You can change the encounters to be in such a way that the enemy composition can be easily overcome or quickly overwhelms. Now, something that takes up a lot of time is descriptions, right? So the dice and the rules are just one part. The other part is like the game master, or the dungeon master, and the players describing what the characters are doing and adding flourishes. One way you can speed up the game is to cut down on that, because you'd be surprised on how much it builds up, right? If you're spending 30 seconds to describe something every turn, like if 4 players are going and then 4 enemies are going, like, do the math, it takes a while, right? That's like what, 4 minutes of descriptions every round. So what you can do is you can keep in mind what all of the players and the enemies are doing, and at the end of the round you can quickly describe the highlights of the round, right? And you can rely on the mechanics and the rules and the announcements that players of what they are doing to tell the story. The other thing you could do is just completely remove the flourishes in the descriptions and just rely on mechanics to tell the story. Now, this is another thing where, like, if you do this, it sort of turns combat into a slog, and it takes away from the joy of playing the game, because part of the reason why people are coming to the table is to hear that sort of description and to be wowed by it and to really feel like they're in that place or seeing that fight. So just be careful with this, that you don't overdo it. But if speed is your utmost goal, yeah, cut this. There's this optional system called the flanking rules. I believe it's in the DMG, it might also be in the player's handbook. But normally, we assume that characters only get advantage if they have inspiration or if they stunt, right? The situation dictates that they have advantage. Like, maybe they're jumping down from a high place onto an enemy's back, right? Yeah, the game master gives them advantage. With flanking rules, characters get advantage if they're on opposite sides of an enemy of theirs. So the thing is, right, in my experience, I played 2 4-year-long campaigns in the 3.5e campaign, and it's really easy to get flanking, like ridiculously easy, right? And you get to a point where basically every attack you make, you're going to have advantage. And with advantage, you're going to hit more likely on average. So because you're hitting more likely on average, you're going to be doing more damage. And if you're doing more damage, enemies and characters are going down quicker, which means the fights are quicker. Now, I will say, it's taken us a while to realize that the game is not really balanced or written assuming that the system is being used. There are a lot of enemies that have things like pack tactics, where they get advantage if they're within, if they're close to another enemy, or if they're close to an ally while attacking an enemy. And, those abilities are basically just mitigated if you can flank. There's also things where, like, having an advantage changes the amount of times you're attacking, right? It changes, or not the amount of times you're attacking, but it changes the amount of times you're doing damage. And some of the higher AC and higher CR enemies are sort of designed with this assumption that characters aren't going to be hitting them very often. So they might go down way faster if that system is brought into play. But again, we're focusing on speed. I think the last thing in this section I want to talk about is theater of mind versus maps and minis. So just to recap as to what these two things are. Theater of mind is everyone is sitting around at the table or looking at their computer monitors, and they're imagining the fight playing out in their heads. They're trying to keep track of where things are spatially in their minds, and there's really no representation, or there's a light amount of representation. You might have like a quick sketch or a map, or you might generally know how many enemies are in what room, etc. Maps and minis is like you have this map, it's divided into squares or hexes, and you have minis representing characters and enemies, and you move them around. So maps and minis is well suited to fewer characters in combat, because, like, when you look at a map, you can see the situation instantly. You don't have to remember how many feet away am I. You can just count the squares. You can see things unfolding like visually, and that's way faster. But the thing is, it's got a lot of overhead when you have a lot of characters in a fight, because the game master and the players have to pick up every character that they control and move them and make a decision for them. And they have to count squares when they're moving, and that takes time. Theater of Mind is the opposite. It really lends itself well to many character fights. It also does well in few character fights. But the thing is, you have to worry about spatial tracking, right? So there's this overhead, like maybe if you guys aren't good at math, or you're not good at keeping track of numbers in your head or distances, or if there's just a lot of characters, yeah, you can get overwhelmed. Like, how many feet away am I from this character? Oh, I'm 30 feet away from this character, but only 25 feet away from this character. Oh, I thought I was in range, but I'm actually not within range. And yeah, if you don't have a good way of tracking that, it will actually slow the game down. So, 5e encourages theater of mind, but it's not designed to support it well because it uses feet, it uses radiuses, it uses adjacency. And that sort of thing, it doesn't lend itself well to theater of mind because, like I said, you have to track feet. There are other games that do theater of mind really well, like 13th Age and Exalted. 13th Age has this system of positioning where you can state that enemies are nearby, they're engaged with you, they're behind you, they're intercepting you, or they're far away, and that's all you have to remember. And that's way easier to remember than the explicit amount of feet. There are other games that are designed very explicitly for maps and minis, like Pathfinder, 3.5e, and 4e. These games really suck when you play them without a map. You have to house rule. You have to make accommodations. But yeah, those games, they tend to do a lot better when you play them with a map. Um, the hybrid way to do this is like have a map that describes the environment and be really, really, really loose with the minis. So this way, visually the players and you can still figure out like who can threaten what and where they can go, but you're not tracking distances, you're not really worrying about stuff like that. I will say if you're playing with the advantage flanking rules, it's easier doing that with the hybrid or the maps and minis because you can just visually see, you don't have to remember. So, if you do that stuff, right, if you play online or you use tools, if you play with the flanking, you cut down your descriptions, you average rolls, um, and you use the right mode of play, like Theater of Mind or Maps and Minis for the right encounters, and you balance your encounters, yeah, you're going to really speed up your encounters. You might make them twice as fast, right? And that might be enough for certain folks, right? But a 4-hour encounter that takes, maybe 2 minutes of in-game time, but 4 hours of real life time, cut down in half is still 2 hours, right? That could eat up a lot of your session, right? And if you're only playing once a month, you're really not getting to do a lot, you know? Or if you're trying to keep the pace up, it's really going to slow things down. Eventually, you're going to have to start house ruling and bending the spirit of the game. So, yeah, what's the spirit of D&D? So like I said before, if you look at the rules, you look at the previous versions of the game, you look at its history as a war game, it's about fighting monsters and dungeon crawling. Like seriously, people say, it's about the narrative and it's about role playing, and yeah, sure, those things have a place in the game and you can try to tell whatever story you want to in D&D. But depending on the type of story you want to tell and the type of game you want to run, you're going to have more or less friction from the system if you choose to use the rules. If you look at the rules depth and the class design, they point to combat adventuring. Like all these things your characters can do, they're basically combat abilities. And yeah, the lip service is paid in the books and by the designers to narrative, investigation, social encounters. But really these things are side activities. They supplement the combat. And yeah, like just to be clear, you can do a great job at social encounters, investigations, narrative, and exploration and stuff in D&D. But the thing is, you're probably going to have to hack the game, or you're going to have to omit rules, or you're going to have to change up your style of play. And that's fine. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. But what I'm saying is, when you do that, you are getting away from the spirit of the game. That's not a bad thing. I'm just saying. And remember, it's Dungeons & Dragons, it's not mysteries and motives, and it's not dialogue and diplomacy. So, why bend the spirit of the game? Well, it comes back to game design. If you don't bend the spirit of the game, you're going to have a bad time trying to make the game faster. the more you move away from the rules, the more you're bending, right? And we need to move away from the rules if we want speed to be our ultimate goal. So the first thing you can do is turn timers, and you can employ skipping. So, go to the store and buy an egg timer, or pull out your cell phone and pull out the stopwatch or the timer and put it on 15 seconds or 30 seconds, and time the turns. Tell the player characters to have X amount of seconds to basically do what they want, and if they can't finish, you move on. Now, if you're going to do this, you need to set this expectation and tell the players that you're going to do this before the campaign or a few sessions in advance, and make sure that they agree to it, right? Make sure they're as interested in speed as you. They want the fights to be as tense as you want to be, and they're okay with turn timers. Now, in terms of skipping, there's this thing called the Angry DM technique, and if you don't know who the Angry DM is, he writes a blog where he releases tips and systems that he's designed for Dungeons and Dragons. And a lot of the stuff he has is really great. I'd advise you check him out. He has this technique where when he's doing combat, he turns to a person and he just says, "What are you doing?" And if they don't respond within a few seconds, he skips them. He goes to the next player. And after he finishes the next player's turn, he'll come back and he'll repeat the same cycle. Now, why is this considered bending? It's considered bending because of initiative, right? The idea behind initiative is your character is able to react within a certain amount of time, and they get to go once a round. And you roll your initiative to determine when everyone gets to go. And on your initiative, your character has made a decision and they get to act on it, right? Now, by doing this, you're bending initiative away from that model of initiative, and you're saying initiative is more about the window of opportunity that you have to act, but it's not necessarily whether you've made a decision. Whether you've made a decision is on the player. When you bend away from the spirit of the rules, you're saying that the characters, right, have less to do with the decisions than their players. Their players are basically the minds of the characters, and the characters are only thinking as fast as the players. And I'm okay with that. I don't have a problem with that, right? Maybe, slowing it down to 15 seconds is cool because it's like the characters are thinking in slow-mo while the players are thinking in real life. And you could sort of think about it that way. There are some games that give you more time depending on how fast you are. We tried something like that for Spiritfall, and it didn't work out too great. But anyways, another thing when it comes to turn timers and skipping is you can have static initiative. You can have characters go in groups, so you can say all the PCs go and then all the enemies go. But really, you're not going to get too much time away from that if you set up your initiative right. If you're really looking for a fast way to do initiative while sticking to the core way of doing it, the Angry DM has a good way of doing it. He has a whole section on how to speed up combat, and he talks about initiative and transitions and how they affect the flow and the speed of the combat pace. But really, they don't affect the actual seconds it takes to do it. So yeah, you can try that. Let's talk about minions and mobs. So 4E had this really cool idea where you could take an enemy, probably an enemy that the player characters have fought before and beat. You can use its stat block, but you change its HP to 1. So like the idea is that the player characters can take this enemy down really quickly. And so if you want to run a encounter that has a lot of enemies, you can throw in a lot of minions, and that way the player characters are dispatching them really quickly, but also the minions are dealing a lot of damage on their turns, and making it feel like a big fight without actually having to take a big fight, without it actually having to take a long time. The opposite side of this is you can take a single enemy and turn them into a mob. So you can take a goblin, you can buff his HP slightly, and then you can say that that single stat block represents 10 to 20 goblins. And what you can do is you can use the goblins and position them where you like, theater of mind or with their minis, and have them rely on that same stat block. But once any of them take damage, you subtract from the same stat block, and once it reaches a certain number, it reaches 0, they're all gone. They're dead. So that works really well if you don't want if you don't want enemies to go down in one hit, but you still want like a lot of mobs and you want a lot of enemies, it works well for that. It also works really well for epic and heroic fantasy games where like enemies, you can imagine your player characters are fighting enemies like trolls and giants, and at lower levels they're taking a while and this is epic fight, but at higher levels these trolls and these giants have just become mooks and the players can dispatch them really quickly. So the idea is this is sort of a hack that makes combat scale well to higher encounters or to higher enemy encounters. There's this idea in Dungeons and Dragons called bounded accuracy, where your roll is only going to be so high and only going to be so low, no matter what level you are. Um, we could take this principle and we could apply it to HP. So this is actually Tim Carney from Tabletop Terrors and Absolute Tabletop's idea. What he does is he cuts the HP of enemies in half, but he buffs the damage that they do by 1d6, 2d6, 3d6, etc. based on their CR. So this is actually pretty ingenious, right? Because enemies are doing more damage, but they have less health. They're going to be breaking the player characters down more, and they're going to be falling way quicker, right? So if you do this, right, like enemies are going to be going down fairly quickly, but players might also be going down fairly quickly. So you can imagine, like, if you do this in conjunction to flanking, and you do this in conjunction to minions and mobs, fights will probably be very quick. And turn timers will speed that up even more. So now, like, you know, if you've applied every technique we've talked about so far, you've probably got that 4-hour encounter down to like maybe an hour, or down to maybe 30 minutes. Now, of course, like, that depends on how much you're leveraging on the descriptions, right? The descriptions are like, if you're still doing descriptions, an hour is probably too quick. It'll probably still take more. But yeah, if you cut those out, like, yeah, you can definitely get down to half an hour, and you can definitely get down to an hour. I think this is a really good idea. The other thing you can try is you can try to double their damage if you half their HP. I don't know how that's going to work in principle. It might be a really good idea. It might be a horrible idea. I haven't tested that. If you're playing with theater in mind, there's a few accommodations you can do. I remember I talked about the zones from 13 Age and Exalted. Well, actually, I haven't talked about zones. So let me back up. Zones are basically saying that, like, instead of worrying about where you are spatially, just think about, like, where you are roughly, right? So let's say that you're in a castle. We could say that every room in this castle is a separate zone and the hallways are a separate zone. So now when we think about the encounter, we think about the enemies that are in the zone you are in. And when we think about ranged attacks, we think about how many zones you can fire away. And, you know, we roughly consider how the zones touch each other and connect. But, you know, we're just sort of throwing that in the back, and we're saying, you know, he's 3 zones away. Maybe he's 2, maybe like the wall is protecting him, but we can ignore that for now. Yeah, he's in range. Go ahead. And then you can combine that with 13 Aegis positions nearby, engaged, far behind, and intercepting. Now, you know, if you do this, you're going to have to go through the game. You're going to have to go through everywhere it says feet. You're going to have to change that to one of these. Or you're going to have to come up with an on-the-fly way of judging that. And that's going to be some work. But if you do that work, your fights are going to get a lot faster. So now, if you do all the things we've said so far, and you do this, like, yeah, you're approaching pretty fast combats. The last thing I think you can do to make combats like blazingly fast, right, is you can create win and stop conditions. So this gets away from the deathmatch idea, right? Because combat could still be 6 quick rounds of everyone fighting to the death. But really, if you think about it, enemies probably won't fight to the death unless they're undead or they're stupid idiot monsters. But even if they're stupid idiot monsters or they're undead, there's probably something you can do to end the encounter. So this might sound arbitrary, right? Especially if you don't do it in a good way narratively, but it works a lot better in practice than you'd expect. I've tried this in Spiritfall, which is basically a tactics combat game, and after X number of rounds, you know, if the players are winning, I just say, yeah, you know, you corner the enemies and the enemies surrender, or you're fighting demons and you push the demon back and you get away, you know. And if they want to continue to fight, I give them the option to continue. But if they want the fight to be over, the fight can be over then. So yeah, the first thing is X number of rounds, you know? Let's say you want your fight to only be 3 rounds. Then after 3 rounds, if the fight is still going, the enemies will surrender, right? Or if the enemies are winning, they might give the players the option to surrender, and if the players don't surrender, you do something mechanically, or you introduce some new enemies that makes that a bad idea. So the players want to consider surrendering, right? You could be designing a fight around a MacGuffin. Maybe the goal of an encounter is to get this artifact, is to get the wand of spout lore, right? And when the enemy gets it, when the enemies get it, they escape, and when the player characters get it, they escape. So yeah, you can make your encounters around some sort of narrative focal point where doing this thing will result in the fight being over. You could also track how many enemies have been killed so that when 50% of the enemy force is gone or 50% of the player characters go down, the combat stops. You could do YHP, so if the player characters get below a certain hit point amount or if the enemies get below a certain hit point amount, yeah, the combat stops. Um, and if you want to if you want to have your bad guys get away, there's such easy ways of doing this, and I feel like people, uh, if they think outside the box just a little bit more, right, they'll discover these, right? So you can give like your big bads or your enemies items, right, to allow them to escape. And again, this you need to establish this with your players before the campaign or a few sessions before you start doing it. This you need to tell them that like this is a thing that might happen, and you need to establish that this is part of the game. So like maybe your big bad has a ring of teleport. He has a ring of etherealness. He has a ring of gaseous form, or he has a ring of plot armor, and he twists the ring of plot armor, and now he runs away and he escapes. Yeah, you know, I'm not a huge fan of this, right? But it's a way you can have your enemies or you can have the fight stop and escape. Um, and then continue on. And I feel like for some of the enemies, it's sort of designed this way. Like if you look at the vampire doesn't die when it reaches 0 HP, it escapes. If you look at a lot of the monsters that are huge bags of HP, I think the assumption being made is you're going to hit that, you're going to fight them in an encounter, you're going to do some damage, the encounter is going to end, the monster is going to move to somewhere else, or narratively the situation is going to advance to somewhere else, and then later on you're going to have another encounter with that enemy. And so like you're fighting the same enemy over the course of multiple encounters. You know, it works a lot better in practice than you'd expect, right? And you just have to make sure that when you're doing this, if you care about balance, you're making it so that like it's as likely that the player characters are in a losing position as the players are, right? Because like it's more likely that the players will get the enemies down to half strength than they will go down, right? So you have to be careful about thinking about that. So let's talk about some system recommendations before doing a quick recap. So let's talk about some games that just do combat really fast. Um, the first game, which I'm selecting, which is probably the closest to Dungeons and Dragons, is Dungeon World. Dungeon World is designed by Adam Coble and Sage Latour, I think. I should have included Sage's name here. It's a powered by the Apocalypse game, which basically means that it has a different framework for its game design. You know, it it tries to think about narrative events and uses dice as a way to resolve narrative events. It's got successful actions, partial actions, and failures when you roll. So like generally in Powered by the Apocalypse games, you roll 2d6 plus a stat, and on a 10 plus something, you get what you want. On a 7 to 9, you get what you want, but at a cost, something else happens. On a failure, you don't get what you want. And the thing about these games, right, is they have these seamless transitions, right? Um, with Dungeons and Dragons, it feels really bimodal. You know, the social encounters, the explorations, that stuff, it feels like one mode of play, and then when you get in combat, everyone puts their combat hats on. Everyone switches modes of play. You bust the battle map out, you know, you're using this completely different system to basically play. So, Dungeon World doesn't have that. It's seamless, right? The same system that you're using to determine narrative events outside the dungeon and in the world is the same system that you're basically using to determine events in the combat.
So maybe you're going up to a merchant and you're trying to haggle for goods, and you roll on a 7 to 9, and he says he'll offer you the goods, but you have to do this for him, or he'll offer these goods to you, but they're going to cost more. You use that same system to say that when you're fighting a group of Sahuagin, on a 10 plus you're going to hit them, but on a 7 to 9, you're going to hit them, but they're also going to hit you, or you're going to hit them, but that's going to leave you exposed to this attack later. The other thing about this is it's low prep, which is something I love. I love low prep games. So you can quickly bust out random encounters for fights, and you can make them go quickly. And the thing is about Dungeon World is it tonally evokes D&D without that mechanical heaviness, right? Um, Getting away from Dungeon World, we have Apocalypse World, which is the game that inspired Dungeon World. It was the first powered by the Apocalypse game. It was designed by D. Vincent Baker. Now, if you don't care about D&D, right, you're looking for just other games, Apocalypse World is a fucking amazing game to play, man. Just check it out. It's so much fun. It's even faster than Dungeon World, I would say, because it's less about fighting and more of just about narrative events and consequences and trade-offs. But when fights happen, man, yeah, they're done in like a minute. um, Okay, Savage Worlds. This is not a powered by the apocalypse game, even though the word world is in the title. It's only slightly faster than 5e. So maybe if you don't want to go too far into the narrative direction, you want some crunch. You can play Savage Worlds. It's basically an OSR game, and with a lot of OSR games, the HP ceilings are really low and the damage floors are really high. So characters take a lot of damage really quickly, and they really can't take much. The thing is with Savage Worlds is it doesn't really scale very well to high enemy encounters. So if you're doing small fights and only small fights, Savage Worlds is probably the way to go if you still want some crunch. Lastly, just because I didn't want to only recommend games that had world in the title, I'm going to recommend three more games, even though one of them also has the word world in the title. Unknown Armies, Call of Cthulhu, and New World of Darkness. These games are, I mean, I guess they're urban fantasy or horror fantasy games, but they're not like medieval fantasy games. They're primarily investigation slash mystery games, and they don't really work really well as those because in most games when you're doing investigations or mysteries, if you can't solve the mystery, like the game has basically stopped. Like you have to be able to advance somehow, right? And these games make the assumption that you're going to be able to advance eventually. And so that's a different talk. We could talk about that later. But anyways, combat is deadly and brutal. It's even deadly and brutal, more brutal than OSR games because you're not meant to get into fights. You're meant to resolve things other ways. And the combat in these games are really low crunch. Okay, so let's summarize all these things that you can do if you're sticking to 5e to speed things up. So you can play online or use tools at the table, which will deal with dice rolls, it will deal with abilities and spell descriptions. You won't have to worry about all that stuff. It'll just be there, and you can cut down the time from that. You can balance encounters using the CR to make the fights quicker by having fewer enemies that are lower CR, or higher enemy or more enemies that are higher CR. And depending on how you play with that lever and how you play with those dimensions, the fights will take longer. They'll also be harder or easier for the player characters. You can cut descriptions out or reduce them entirely. So that way you're cutting down the time it takes to just announce or describe what's going on in a round. You can play with the flanking rules. If you play with the flanking rules, people will take more damage more regularly, and that will translate to people going down faster. You can choose theater of mind or maps and minis depending upon the encounter. So if the encounter is better suited for theater of mind, pick theater of mind. And if you're going with theater of mind, use the accommodations, right? Use the distances, the distance ranges that we were talking about. Use zones. If you're using maps and minis, probably be a little bit looser with the ranges, so you don't have to count squares. And go a little bit go with the hybrid approach. And if you have a bunch of minis, or a bunch of enemies, find a better way to represent them. Just say that they're around you, or use like a pool of dice or something. I don't know. You can use turn timers, or you can use the angry DM technique. Ask the players what they're doing, and if they don't respond right away, move to the next player. Come back when that player's turn is done. You can use minions and mobs. If you really want fights with a lot of enemies, or even just few enemies but lower HP enemies, give them 1 HP, but keep their stat block. Or the inverse, take 1 stat block, pretend like it's multiple enemies, and then when that stat block reaches 0 HP, all those enemies are dead. You can use Tim Carney's bounded HP, double the damage or increase the damage by 1d6, 2d6, 3d6, depending on the CR, and then half the HP that enemies have. You can create win/stop conditions, right? So after X amount of rounds, after let's say 6 rounds or 3 rounds, the fight will stop and whoever is winning has won. Or once this side or the other side gets this MacGuffin, the fight will stop. Or, once the baddie gets to a certain amount of HP, he's going to twist his ring of teleport or etherealness and he's going to fuck off. Lastly, if that still isn't fast enough for you and it's really making you angry, you could switch to another system. But I do got to say, if you do all of these things, you're going to get a really fast game, right? You might cut down that 4-hour encounter to a 1-hour encounter or a half an hour encounter. You might cut down that 1-hour encounter to a 10-minute encounter or a 5-minute encounter. You might cut down that 5-minute encounter to a 1-minute encounter. There's still going to be a ceiling to how quickly you can get, right? But I hope that if you judiciously apply all of these techniques, you'll see a lot of improvement in your speed. And remember, with game design and engineering in general, there's always trade-offs. So because you're focusing on speed, you're going to be losing other things. You're going to have to bend the rules. You're going to have to prep the games in such a way to make things faster. You're going to have to change up the way you play. And if you don't want to do that, then you probably won't be able to reach these speeds, right? But hopefully, if you start to apply these, you'll see the improvement. And let me know. I'm curious to see like metrics. I haven't actually measured how many minutes have been cut by each of these things. So it would be really great if people could try these out and let me know, hey, cutting descriptions generally gives us a 10% improvement. Now, if you're doing that, you're probably going to make your encounter slower because you're cracking the time. So that's a little paradox there. But hey, just try it out and just let me know how it goes. I hope this has been helpful. And I hope this has been more solid than like wishy-washy stuff. Once again, Fahad Syed. You can check out my stuff at spiritfall.net. And thanks so much for getting this far and listening to me babble. Peace out and happy gaming.